Some storms change a man's life forever. I know this because I lived through one. The rocking chair creaks beneath me as I lean forward, studying my grandson's face in the amber glow of the kerosene lamp. Tommy's 16 now, all gangly limbs and questions about everything under God's wide sky. Tonight, his eyes fix on the wedding photograph hanging above the mantel. My Victoria, beautiful as a spring morning, standing beside a younger version of myself, who still believed the world owed him nothing but hard knocks. Grandpa Cal, tell me again how you met Grandma. His voice carries that restless energy of youth, the same fire that once burned in my chest when I was his age. The real story, not the Sunday school version. I chuckle, feeling every one of my 73 years settling into my bones like sediment in a creek bed. Outside, December wind rattles the windows of the same house where Victoria and I raised 5 children and watched them scatter like dandelion seeds across the territory. Some storms bring destruction. Others bring gifts wrapped in ice and fury, delivered by hands that don't know gentle from harsh. Pull that chair closer, boy. This tale requires proper telling. Tommy scoots his wooden chair near mine, eyes bright with expectation. The fire pops in the hearth, sending shadows dancing across walls lined with 40 years of memories. Photographs of children and grandchildren, cattle awards, newspaper clippings from the territorial days, when news traveled slow and meant more when it finally arrived. I close my eyes and suddenly it's 1883 again. The weight of shame sits heavy on my shoulders like a yoke I'd grown accustomed to carrying, and the taste of failure lingers bitter as burnt coffee on my tongue. Montana territory stretched endless in those days, raw and unforgiving as a fresh wound that refused to heal proper. Towns were scattered dots connected by hope and stubbornness, where a man's word carried more weight than gold certificates and winter could kill the unwary without offering so much as a warning whistle. The railroad had reached Helena 2 years prior, bringing civilization and its complications. But out where I worked, the land still belonged to whoever was strong enough to hold it. I worked as a line rider then for the Thompson Cattle Company, earning $30 a month to patrol fence lines and check water holes across 10,000 acres of grassland that rolled like a green ocean under the biggest sky God ever stretched. Honest work for honest pay, though it wasn't the life I'd planned when I was Tommy's age and thought the world would bend to my will if I just worked hard enough. The Thompson outfit ran 2,000 head of longhorn cattle, tough animals bred for survival in country that didn't forgive weakness. My job was to ride the boundaries, fix broken fence wire, check for signs of rustlers or predators, and report back to the main ranch house twice weekly. Simple work that required a steady hand, a good horse, and the kind of patience that comes from having nowhere else to be. 4 years earlier, drought had murdered my family's homestead like a slow poison working through healthy veins. My father, God rest his troubled soul, had claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act of 1862, built a cabin with his own cows and hens, and planted his dreams in Montana soil that seemed willing to nurture them. The land gave back generously for 15 years, corn standing tall as a man's shoulder, wheat golden as my mother's hair in autumn sunlight. Then the rain stopped coming. 1879 brought the worst drought in territorial memory, a merciless season that turned creeks to cracked mud and grass to tinder that sparked at a horse's footfall. Crops withered to dust while I watched, helpless as a man watching his children starve. Cattle died standing up, too weak to fall down proper, their bones bleaching white under a sun that never seemed to set. The creek that had never failed since white men first settled the valley went bone dry for the first time in living memory, leaving only smooth stones and the smell of dying fish. I fought that drought like a man wrestling with the devil himself, hauling water in barrels from springs 15 miles distant, watching my mother's vegetable garden turn to powder despite my efforts, seeing my father age a decade in a single summer of watching his life's work disappear. We ate thin soup made from whatever we could find, traded possessions for grain, and prayed to a God who seemed to have forgotten our postal address. The cattle died first, then the horses, except for 2 we couldn't bear to sell. My mother's chickens lasted longer than expected, tough birds that could find sustenance in places that defeated larger animals. But when autumn came without rain and winter promised to be harsh, we knew the battle was lost before the first snow fell. When the drought finally broke in late 1880, The debts remained like unwanted guests who'd overstayed their welcome. The First National Bank of Helena had extended credit during the good years, confident that Morrison Land would always produce enough to cover the notes. But drought don't care about promissory notes or good intentions. The bank foreclosed on Christmas Eve of 1879, presenting papers signed by judges who'd never felt Montana wind or seen what it looked like when a man's dreams dried up and blew away. "Merry Christmas," the banker had said, removing his hat in mock respect. "Your land belongs to us now. You have until New Year's to remove your personal effects." I packed my few possessions in saddlebags that had belonged to my grandfather, loaded what remained of our belongings onto a borrowed wagon, and helped my parents move to my uncle's place in Billings. They died there within 2 years, my mother first from lung fever, my father 3 months later from what the doctor called heart failure. But what I knew was a broken spirit finally giving up the fight. I rode away from everything I'd ever known on a gray January morning in 1880, leading a pack horse and carrying $47 in silver coins, all that remained of 25 years of family effort. Didn't look back. Looking back would have shattered what little pride I had left, and pride was about all that stood between me and complete surrender. Since then, I drifted from ranch to ranch like tumblewood, hiring on where fair strong backs and steady nerves were needed. I fixed fence with wire that cut my hands raw, broke horses whose spirits reminded me of my own stubborn refusal to admit defeat, doctored sick cattle with remedies learned from men who'd forgotten more about ranching than most people ever learn, and tried not to think about the grave markers I'd carved myself and left behind in that lonely cemetery overlooking land that should have been mine. The work was honest and the pay regular, but it wasn't building toward anything permanent. Just survival, one day after another, like a man treading water in a river that never stopped flowing toward some distant ocean he'd never see. The morning everything changed started clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline air that makes distant mountains look close enough to touch and shadows crisp as winter morning that had fallen 3 days prior. I'd ridden out from the line shack before dawn to check the north pasture fence after reports of wire down near Thunder Creek, where ice and wind conspired to test every repair a man might make. My horse, a steady bay gelding named Ranger, picked his way carefully through patches of crusty snow while I studied the gray wall of clouds building on the western horizon like an army preparing for battle. Ranger was 8 years old, steady as church on Sunday, with enough sense to find his way home even when his rider couldn't see past his horse's ears. Thompson had assigned him to me personally, recognizing that line riding required a partnership between man and animal that couldn't be rushed or forced. A man learns to read weather like scripture when his life depends on the accuracy of his predictions. Those clouds carried the smell of serious snow, the kind that drops fast and mean and doesn't care what plans you had for tomorrow. The barometric pressure was falling like a stone thrown down a well, and the wind carried that peculiar stillness that comes before nature shows her teeth. I finished the fence repair in record time, tightening wire with quick, efficient movements while keeping one eye on the advancing storm. 3 posts had snapped where ice had accumulated on the wire, creating pressure that finally exceeded what seasoned pine could bear. I replaced them with spare posts, carried on my pack horse, stretched new wire tight as a fiddle string, and secured the connections with practiced hands that knew their business. The work took 2 hours that felt like minutes when measured against the approaching threat. By the time I loaded my tools and prepared to head back to the line shack, the wind had shifted to the northwest and begun speaking in the harsh voice that meant business. The wind hit first. Not the gentle morning breeze that had stirred the grass when I'd started my repairs, but a living thing with teeth and claws that tried to tear the hat from my head and numbed my face despite the wool scarf wrapped around my neck. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in what felt like minutes, cold settling into my bones with the hungry efficiency of a predator that had found easy prey. Ranger snorted and danced sideways, his winter coat already beginning to stand up as ice crystals formed on the longer hairs. He'd lived through enough Montana winters to know what was coming, and his nervousness infected me like a disease passed from animal to man. Then the snow arrived. It didn't fall so much as attack, driving horizontal needles of ice that stung exposed skin and turned the familiar landscape into something alien and hostile. Visibility dropped from miles to yards to arm's length in the time it took a man to button his coat, the world disappearing behind a white curtain that moved and shifted like something alive. The wind howled like all the lost souls in creation, a sound that cuts through a man's bones and settles cold in his marrow. Trees bent until their tops touched the ground. Snow devils spun across open ground like miniature tornadoes, and the very air seemed to turn solid with ice and fury. I turned Ranger toward the line shack, trusting his instincts more than my own rapidly diminishing ability to navigate. Horses possess knowledge that men don't about finding home in conditions that defeat human senses. His ears swiveled constantly, catching sounds I couldn't hear, and his body moved with the careful purpose of an animal whose ancestors had survived countless storms by respecting nature's power. The world became a white tunnel of howling fury where up and down lost meaning, and the only reality was the next step forward through drifts already knee-deep and climbing with each gust of wind. My face felt like it was being flayed with invisible knives, and breathing required conscious effort as the cold tried to freeze my lungs solid. That's when I saw her, a dark shape against the snow, half buried in a drift beside a cluster of aspen trees whose bare branches clattered like skeleton fingers in the wind. At first, through the white chaos, I thought it was a fallen log, or maybe a lost calf that had wandered away from the herd. The storm played tricks on a man's eyes, making rocks look like animals and shadows seem like solid objects. But then the wind shifted the snow for just a moment, and I saw fabric. Dark blue wool, expensive cloth that caught what little light penetrated the storm. The kind of fabric that cost more than I made in 3 months, woven tight and dyed deep with materials that had traveled farther than most people ever would. I dismounted and struggled through the drifts, each step a battle against wind that tried to push me backward and snow that grabbed at my boots like quicksand. The cold bit through my coat immediately, reminding me that exposure killed faster than bullets in weather like this. She lay on her side in the lee of the largest aspen, one arm extended as if she'd been reaching for something when she fell. Snow had already begun the process of claiming her, nature's way of burying what couldn't save itself. Her position suggested she'd been walking when the storm hit, trying to find shelter that didn't exist in open country. Her face was pale as the snow around her, lips tinged blue with cold that had progressed beyond the point where shivering could help. But she was breathing, barely, so shallow that I had to watch her chest carefully to detect movement, but breathing nonetheless. Her body temperature had dropped to the point where her heart could stop any moment if I didn't act quickly. She was beautiful, even half frozen. Dark hair escaped from beneath a fur-lined hat that had probably cost more than my horse, framing features that spoke of breeding and refinement. High cheekbones, straight nose, skin that had never been weathered by wind or darkened by sun. Her riding habit was tailored perfectly, fitted to her figure by someone who understood both fashion and function. Quality boots made from leather soft as silk, fine doe-skin gloves. Everything about her whispered money and position and a life lived far from the harsh realities that shape people like me. But out here in the storm's teeth, money couldn't buy her another breath. Breeding couldn't warm her blood. Position meant nothing to the wind that was trying to kill us both. I gathered her in my arms, surprised by how light she felt, like a bird with hollow bones. Her body was cold as creek stones in January, no warmth left to fight the winter trying to claim her. She felt fragile in a way that spoke of a life spent in drawing rooms and carriages, protected from the kind of work that built calluses and muscle. One gloved hand clutched something tightly, knuckles white with effort even in unconsciousness. A letter, I realized, though the expensive envelope was now soggy with melted snow and ice. The writing was elegant script, the kind taught in finishing schools back east, but the ink had run enough that I couldn't make out the address or sender. Whatever message that letter contained, it had been important enough for her to hold on to, even when consciousness fled. The letter told a story I couldn't read yet, but its very presence suggested urgency. Women of obvious wealth didn't ride alone into blizzards clutching correspondence unless something had driven them beyond the boundaries of normal behavior. Fear, perhaps, or anger or desperation born from circumstances I couldn't yet imagine. Getting her across Ranger's saddle took precious minutes I wasn't sure either of us could spare. The horse stood steady as granite while I secured her with my rope. then pulled myself up behind her, wrapping my heavy coat around both of us. The storm raged harder now, wind screaming across the plain with increasing fury, snow falling so thick it seemed solid as a wall. The ride back to the line shack became a nightmare journey through white hell. Ranger fought for every step, his hooves slipping on ice hidden beneath snow that was already past his knees in places. I held the woman against my chest, feeling her heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird's wings, trying to share what little warmth my body could generate. "Hold on," I whispered to her unhearing ears, my words stolen by the wind before they could travel 6 inches. "Don't you quit on me now. We're almost there." But almost there meant nothing in a world where landmarks disappeared and distance became meaningless. Every direction looked the same. Every step forward felt like moving deeper into a white maze with no exit. The cold crept through my clothes with patient persistence, reminding me that heroism froze just as quick as cowardice when the temperature dropped low enough. Ranger knew the way even when I didn't, following instincts bred into him by generations of horses who'd survived Montana winters by respecting the land's power to kill. His head hung low against the wind, ice forming on his muzzle, but his feet found purchase where mine would have failed, carrying us towards safety I hoped still existed. The line shack materialized from the blizzard like answered prayer, a dark rectangle of salvation in the endless white chaos. The small cabin had never looked so beautiful, its weathered logs and crooked chimney representing the difference between life and death. I half carried, half dragged her to the door, kicked it open with a boot that had lost most feeling, and stumbled into darkness thick as black wool. The cabin felt cold as a tomb, no fire laid, no warmth anywhere except what our bodies carried. But it was shelter, 4 walls and a roof that would hold against the storm, and shelter meant the possibility of survival. The familiar smell of wood smoke and coffee grounds and the indefinable scent of human habitation greeted me like an old friend. I laid her on the floor near the stone hearth, my hands shaking from cold and exhaustion and fear as I felt for a pulse at her throat. Weak but steady, like a bird's heartbeat under my fingertips. Her breathing was so shallow I had to put my ear close to her lips to detect it. Each exhalation a small victory against the cold trying to claim her completely. Minutes, maybe less, before hypothermia finished what the storm had started. Fire. Everything depended on fire now. My hands trembled from cold or fear as I fumbled with flint and steel, the familiar motions made clumsy by urgency and decreased dexterity. The first strike produced nothing but sparks that died in the darkness like falling stars. The second strike caught a fragment of tinder, a tiny orange glow that represented hope itself, fragile as a newborn's breath, but real enough to build upon. I fed the small flame carefully, adding thin strips of birch bark, then pencil-thin twigs, then progressively larger pieces of seasoned pine. Each stage required patience when patience felt impossible. But fire couldn't be rushed any more than life could be forced back into a body that was surrendering to cold. Light bloomed in the cabin as the fire caught properly, pushing back shadows that had claimed the room and beginning the slow process of warming air that felt thick as molasses. Heat followed grudgingly, radiating out from the hearth in waves that seemed to move like living things across the wooden floor. The woman hadn't moved during the fire building, but her breathing seemed marginally steadier in the growing warmth. Color hadn't returned to her face yet, but the deathly pallor was fading slowly, replaced by something that suggested life rather than its absence. Her riding habit was soaked through, ice crystals melting into puddles that spread across the floor around her body. The expensive fabric would be ruined, but fabric could be replaced. Life couldn't. I knew what needed to be done and tried not to think about the impropriety of undressing an unconscious woman, even to save her life. Survival doesn't follow drawing room rules or acknowledge social conventions that seemed meaningless when measured against death's proximity. Working quickly but carefully, I removed her outer garments, wrapping her in my only blanket while hanging her wet clothes near the fire where they could dry. The blanket was wool, scratchy, and worn but clean, purchased from a trader in Miles City who'd accepted half my month's wages for it. Her undergarments were fine cotton and silk, the kind of intimate apparel that represented more money than most families spent on necessities in half a year. Delicate lace, tiny buttons made from pearl, stitching so fine it might have been done by fairies. But they were mostly dry, and dryness might be what stood between her and death. The mysterious letter fell from her nerveless fingers as I adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. The envelope bore an expensive watermark and that elegant handwriting, but the snow and ice had smudged the ink beyond easy reading. The paper felt substantial, the kind used for important correspondence, and the wax seal had been broken recently enough that fragments still clung to the flap. I set the letter aside without attempting to read it, focusing instead on the immediate task of warming her hands and feet. I rubbed circulation back into fingers that felt like ice, working methodically from fingertips to wrists, feeling for the return of warmth that would signal renewed blood flow. She was beautiful. The thought struck me again as firelight played across features that belonged in portrait paintings rather than frontier cabins. Not merely pretty like a china doll, but beautiful in the way mountains were beautiful, with strength beneath the elegance that suggested substance beyond appearance. Early 30s, I guessed, with the kind of bone structure that would age gracefully and eyes that would hold wisdom when the years had passed. Whoever she was, wherever she'd come from, she was somebody important. The quality of her clothes alone told that story, but there was something in her bearing, even unconscious, that spoke of authority and position. This was a woman accustomed to being listened to, respected, perhaps even feared by those who crossed her will. But important people died in blizzards, same as poor cowboys, if they weren't careful. Nature played no favorites when winter showed its teeth. The storm raging outside cared nothing for social position or bank accounts or family names that commanded respect in drawing rooms hundreds of miles from here. I made weak coffee with snow melted in my dented tin pot, more water than grounds but warm enough to matter. The coffee was honest frontier brew, strong enough to wake the dead and bitter enough to make them sorry they'd awakened, but heat mattered more than flavor when measured against hypothermia's advance. When the coffee was ready, I lifted her head gently and tried to get some between her lips. She coughed at the first contact, eyelids fluttering like butterfly wings, and managed to swallow a few drops before falling back into unconsciousness. Those few swallows gave me more hope than I'd felt since finding her in the snow. The simple act of swallowing meant her body was still fighting, still trying to preserve itself against the cold that had nearly claimed her. Reflexes worked, muscles responded, life persisted despite appearances that suggested otherwise. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, announcing its intention to continue through the night and possibly into tomorrow. Wind shook the cabin walls like an angry giant testing the strength of mortal construction, probing for weakness that might let winter inside to steal our warmth. Snow piled against the door and windows, sealing us into this small space while nature tried to murder everything beyond these walls. I fed the fire steadily, building heat that would sustain us through the long night ahead. The wood supply was adequate if managed carefully, enough seasoned pine and oak to last 3 days if the storm persisted that long. Water could be obtained by melting snow. Food consisted of coffee, hardtack, and jerky, sufficient for survival if not comfort. The routine of tending the fire gave me something to focus on besides the woman's condition and the storm's fury. Split wood, arrange it properly, maintain consistent heat without wasting fuel. Simple tasks that required attention but left room for thought, and thinking led inevitably to questions I couldn't yet answer. What had driven a woman of obvious wealth and position to ride alone into weather that threatened to turn lethal? The storm's approach had been visible for hours before it arrived, plenty of warning for anyone with sense to seek shelter. Yet she'd been miles from any town or ranch house when I'd found her, traveling light with no apparent destination except away from wherever she'd started. The letter clutched in her hand suggested urgency, correspondence important enough to risk her life protecting. Bad news, perhaps, or good news that couldn't wait for safer traveling conditions. Family emergency, business crisis, or personal matters that demanded immediate attention regardless of weather. But speculation led nowhere useful. Whatever had brought her into the storm's path, the immediate concern was keeping her alive long enough to ask questions that might yield answers. The rest could wait for consciousness and the return of warmth that would make conversation possible. Near midnight, she stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, confusion clouding features still pinched with cold, but no longer gray with approaching death. Blue eyes, I noted, dark blue like deep water reflecting summer sky. They found my face in the firelight, struggled to focus through the fog of hypothermia and exhaustion, widened with alarm that suggested intelligence returning. "Easy," I said quietly, keeping my voice gentle but confident. "You're safe now." She tried to sit up, gasped at some pain that shot through her body, fell back against the folded coat I'd placed under her head for comfort. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, rough with cold and fear and the confusion that follows trauma. "Where am I?" "Line shack on the Thompson Range. Name's Cal Mitchell." I offered her the tin cup, steam rising from coffee that smelled better than it would taste. "You need to drink this." Slowly. She stared at me for a long moment, memory returning in fragments that didn't quite fit together yet. Her gaze moved from my face to the cabin's interior, taking in the rough walls, simple furnishings, and primitive conditions that must have seemed like another world compared to whatever luxury she was accustomed to. "The storm," she said finally, understanding beginning to dawn. "I remember falling. The cold. Found you a few hours ago. You were mostly gone when I reached you." She accepted the cup with both hands, noting their tremor with the kind of clinical assessment that suggested intelligence and self-awareness. The coffee was terrible, strong enough to dissolve horseshoes and bitter as medicine, but she drank it anyway, recognizing necessity over preference. "Thank you," she said after several careful sips. "I would have died out there. Anyone would have done the same." "Would they?" She studied my face in the firelight, and I caught something in her expression that spoke of knowledge about people's capacity for selfishness. "I'm not so certain about that." There was wisdom in those blue eyes, hard-earned and painful, the kind that came from experience rather than education. Whatever life she'd lived before this night, it had taught her lessons about human nature that sheltered ladies weren't supposed to learn. Disappointment lingered there, and wariness, as if she'd discovered that wealth and position attracted people for the wrong reasons. "What's your name?" I asked. She hesitated, just for a heartbeat, but I caught the pause and filed it away for later consideration. The hesitation was deliberate, calculated, suggesting that her identity might be more complicated than simple introduction would reveal. "Victoria," she said finally. "Victoria Sterling." The Sterling name meant nothing to me then, though it should have. In my defense, I'd been drifting long enough that local politics and ranch ownership had become somebody else's business. I fixed fence and moved cattle and drew my wages, keeping my head down and my opinions to myself in the tradition of hired men who understood their place in the social order. But the way she said it, with subtle emphasis that suggested the name should carry weight, hinted at significance I was missing. Sterling, like sterling silver, precious and pure and valuable. A name chosen for its implications, or inherited from ancestors who'd made it mean something important. "Well, Miss Sterling, you picked a hell of a night to be out riding alone." She almost smiled at that, the first hint of warmth I'd seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. The smile reached her eyes, chasing away some of the wariness and revealing humor that suggested strength beneath the refinement. "The storm developed faster than expected," she said, which was true enough but felt incomplete, like she was editing her story for an audience that didn't need complete truth. Montana weather could turn deadly in minutes, catching even experienced travelers off guard when conditions aligned in particularly dangerous ways. But something about her answer suggested there were missing pieces, details she wasn't ready to share with a stranger who'd saved her life, but hadn't yet earned her complete trust. "Where were you headed?" Another hesitation, longer this time, and I saw her weighing how much truth to reveal. Her hands tightened around the coffee cup, seeking warmth and comfort from its simple heat. "Away," she said finally, "away from where I was." That told me nothing and everything simultaneously. Away suggested escape rather than destination, flight rather than journey towards something desired. A woman of obvious means didn't ride alone into weather that threatened to kill her unless something had made staying put seem worse than risking death in a blizzard. "Running from something?" I asked gently. "Someone," she corrected, and pain flickered across her features like shadows cast by firelight. "Someone who believes he has the right to make my choices for me." The bitterness in those words spoke of recent conflict, decisions made by others without her consent, autonomy threatened by people who confused authority with ownership. In a territory where women had few legal rights and fewer practical options, escape sometimes required dramatic action that looked foolish to outsiders who didn't understand the circumstances that forced such choices. Well, you won't be going anywhere for a day or two, I said, glancing toward the door where wind continued to rattle the wooden frame. This storm's got teeth, and it's not finished showing them yet. She nodded, pulling my blanket tighter around her shoulders. The wool was rough against skin accustomed to silk and fine cotton, but it was warm and clean and carried the honest scent of a working man who took care of his possessions. For the first time since consciousness returned, she seemed to relax slightly, as if accepting that immediate safety had been achieved. "Tell me about yourself, Cal Mitchell," she said quietly, settling back against the makeshift pillow. "How does a man end up working alone in places like this?" The question caught me off guard. Most people, especially people of her obvious station, didn't much care about the life stories of hired hands. We were functional parts of their world, like tools or animals, useful for specific purposes, but not particularly interesting as individuals with histories and dreams and disappointments. But her interests seemed genuine, and the long night stretched ahead of us with nothing but time and conversation to fill the hours before dawn brought its own challenges. "Lost my family's homestead a few years back," I said, surprised by how easily the words came. "Been riding from place to place ever since." "I'm sorry," she said, and the sympathy in her voice sounded real rather than polite. "That must have been difficult." "Drought doesn't care about your plans," I replied, settling back against the wall where I could watch both the fire and her face. "Neither do banks when the notes come due." She was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames that danced and flickered in the stone hearth. The fire cast moving shadows across her features, making her seem younger sometimes, older others, like a person caught between different versions of herself. "Loss has a way of changing everything, doesn't it?" she said finally, "making us into people we never thought we'd become." There was fresh pain in those words, wounds that hadn't finished healing. Whatever had sent her riding alone into a Montana blizzard carried the weight of recent grief, loss that was still reshaping who she thought she was. "Your folks?" I asked gently. "My father passed 6 months ago." Her voice remained steady, but I heard the effort required to maintain that control. Everything changed after that. I understood about fathers dying, about the way the world shifts on its axis when the man who taught you about strength and honor disappears, leaving you to figure out how to carry on without his guidance. The ground feels less solid afterward, like you're walking on ice that might crack under the weight of decisions you're not sure you're qualified to make. He was a good man, I'm guessing. The best. A tear escaped before she could stop it, turning to silver in the firelight. He built something important and left it to me to protect. He was thorough in his planning, prepared for challenges he hoped I'd never face. Some days I wonder if I'm strong enough for that responsibility. "Strength isn't about never falling down," I said, thinking of my own failures and the lessons they'd taught me. "It's about getting back up when you do." She looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing something unexpected in a hired cowboy warming himself by a fire in a one-room cabin miles from anywhere that mattered to people like her. Her expression shifted, wariness giving way to something that might have been recognition. "Is that what you did?" she asked. "Got back up?" The question hung between us like smoke from the fire, demanding honesty I wasn't sure I was ready to give. Had I gotten back up after losing everything? Or had I been running ever since, afraid to plant roots anywhere they might get torn up again by forces beyond my control? "Still working on it," I admitted. The honesty of that answer seemed to satisfy her more than false confidence would have. She settled deeper into the blanket, some tension leaving her shoulders, as if she'd found something trustworthy all in my admission of ongoing struggle. "This is quite an adventure," she said, and there was something almost like amusement in her voice. Not the word most folks would use for nearly freezing to death. "Most folks haven't lived the life I have." She smiled again, and it was warmer this time, more genuine. "Sometimes an adventure is exactly what you need, even if it arrives wearing the costume of disaster." I studied her profile in the firelight, noting the strength in the line of her jaw, the intelligence that animated her features even when exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders. Victoria Sterling was no helpless flower wilting under adversity, Whatever had sent her into the storm, she'd made that choice deliberately, accepting risks that would have paralyzed lesser people. What kind of life teaches a woman to think that way? I asked. The kind where you learn early that safety is often just another word for prison, she replied, and there was steel beneath the silk in those words. That stopped me cold. What kind of safety felt like imprisonment to a woman with her obvious advantages? Money, position, fine clothes, education, all the things I'd lost and couldn't hope to regain. What else could there be to want beyond security and comfort? But looking at her face in the firelight, I began to understand. Sometimes the finest cages were built from gold and lined with velvet, so beautiful that observers couldn't see the bars that held their occupants captive. Sometimes freedom required breaking expensive chains that others envied. The storm howled outside with undiminished fury, shaking the cabin like it wanted inside to steal our warmth and drag us back into the white death that waited beyond these walls. But here, with the fire burning steady and this mysterious woman sharing stories of loss and survival, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. For the first time in 4 years, I felt home. Get some rest, I said quietly. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, and you'll need strength to face them. She nodded, closing her eyes but not sleeping yet, like someone savoring the safety that allowed such luxury. Cal? Yes, ma'am? Thank you, not just for saving my life, for seeing me as more than someone who needed rescuing. I wanted to tell her that anyone with eyes could see she was extraordinary, that her strength showed in every word, every gesture, every brave smile in the face of circumstances that would have broken lesser people. But those words felt too large for the small space between us, too intimate for a hired hand to speak to a lady whose real story remained hidden behind careful answers and meaningful silences. Instead, I simply said, "Sleep well, Victoria Sterling." But as I sat watching over her rest, feeding the fire that kept death at bay, I knew something fundamental had shifted. The storm had brought more than snow and ice to this remote cabin. It had delivered possibility, fragile as a newborn's breath, but real as the warmth growing between us, despite all the reasons it shouldn't exist. The letter lay forgotten near her sleeping form, its secrets safe until consciousness returned and explanations became necessary. But I sensed that whatever truths that correspondence contained would change everything again, just as surely as the storm had changed the landscape beyond these walls. Outside, winter raged against the walls with increasing fury, testing every joint and board with wind that screamed like living things in torment. Inside, something precious and unexpected began to bloom, tender as spring flowers pushing through the last snow. I didn't know it yet, but my wandering days were ending. The storm that had nearly killed her was delivering the answer to prayers I'd been too proud to pray, wrapped in blue wool and sealed with a kiss I hadn't yet received, but could already taste in the space between what was and what might be. Sometimes the best gifts arrive in the fiercest storms. Sometimes salvation wears the face of someone who needs saving too. That night, watching over Victoria Sterling while the blizzard tried to tear the world apart, I began to remember what it felt like to have something worth protecting, something worth fighting for, something worth staying put to defend, even when staying meant risking everything I thought I'd learned about keeping my heart safe from the kind of loss that could destroy a man completely. The fire burned low, and I fed it again, coaxing flame from ember like hope from ashes. Tomorrow would bring truth, whatever form that truth decided to take. Tonight there was only warmth and breath and the quiet promise of possibility growing between two souls who'd found each other in the white fury of a Montana blizzard. Outside, the storm howled on. Inside, something beautiful and dangerous began. The second morning dawned pale and cold, with snow still falling, but without the murderous fury that had marked the storm's peak. Victoria woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, surprised to find herself warm and safe in circumstances that should have killed here. The events of the previous night returned slowly, like pieces of a puzzle assembling themselves in her consciousness, while her body reminded her of how close death had come calling. Cal sat near the fire, cooking breakfast with the efficient movements of a man accustomed to caring for himself in places where mistakes could prove fatal. He'd been awake for hours, she realized, keeping the fire burning while she slept under his only blanket. The selflessness of that simple act reached something deep in her chest, a place that had grown cold from too many people wanting things from her rather than wanting to give something precious away. "Morning, he said without turning around, somehow sensing her return to consciousness. "Coffee's ready when you are. Storm's backing off, but we're still locked in for today." She sat up carefully, testing her body's responses to movement. Everything worked, though her ankle throbbed where she'd twisted it during her fall, and her muscles felt like they'd been beaten with clubs. The hypothermia was gone, replaced by bone-deep weariness that follows close encounters with forces larger than human will or determination. "How much snow fell?" 3 feet, maybe 4 in the drifts. Wind's dying down, though. Give it another day and we might see clear sky." He handed her a tin plate with bacon and hardtack, simple food that somehow tasted better than anything served in the finest restaurants. Your body needed the rest. Healing takes energy. She accepted the plate gratefully, noting how he'd managed to make burnt bacon seem like a feast through careful attention to her comfort. Survival made everything precious, even coffee strong enough to dissolve horseshoes and hardtack that could have been used for building materials. "Tell me about your work," Victoria said, settling back against the wall with her breakfast. "What's it like riding alone across all that country day after day?" Cal considered the question while chewing hardtack that required serious commitment to consume. "Peaceful, mostly. A man learns things about himself when it's just him and the sky and whatever thoughts he's been carrying around like rocks in his pockets." "What kinds of things does he learn?" "Whether he's running towards something or away from it, whether the quiet makes him comfortable or drives him toward town, looking for noise and company to fill up the empty spaces." He met her eyes across the fire, and she saw depths there that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Whether he's the kind of man who can be trusted with solitude. The insight in those words surprised her. Most men she'd known filled silence with talk, as if empty air represented failure rather than opportunity for reflection and growth. But Cal seemed to understand that some thoughts required space to develop properly, like plants that needed room for their roots to spread. "And what did you discover about yourself during all that riding?" "That I'd been running when I thought I was just moving forward. That losing the farm taught me more about what matters than owning it ever did." He poured coffee into her cup, steam rising like incense in the cold air. "That pride's a poor substitute for purpose, and purpose is hard to find when you're afraid to put down roots anywhere they might get torn up again." The honesty in his voice reached places in her heart that had been protected by walls built from years of disappointment and betrayal. Here was a man who'd lost everything and found wisdom in the losing, who'd chosen growth over bitterness when either path would have been understandable given his circumstances. "What about you?" Cal asked, settling back with his own coffee. "What drives a woman of obvious breeding to risk her life riding alone into weather that could kill a grizzly bear?" Victoria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever anyone probed too close to truths she wasn't ready to share completely. The letter still lay folded in her coat pocket, its contents representing threats and opportunities in equal measure. "Sometimes staying becomes more dangerous than leaving," she said carefully. "I had to leave quickly, before Blackstone's men could stop me. He'd already posted guards at the main roads, so I took the back trail through the mountains. Alone was the only way to avoid detection, testing how much truth this man could handle. Sometimes the people who claim to want to protect you are the ones you most need protection from." "Someone forcing your hand?" "Several someones, actually, but one in particular." The words came out harder than she'd intended, edged with anger that had been building for months. "Theodore Blackstone, a banker from Denver who's decided I need a husband to manage what my father left me." Cal's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. "And you don't agree with his assessment of your capabilities?" "I've been managing perfectly well on my own. Better than well, actually. The Sterling Ranch is more profitable now than it was when my father was alive." Pride crept into her voice, the satisfaction of someone who'd proven herself against those who'd expected failure. "But territorial law gives men like Blackstone ways to pressure women like me into accepting their protection." "What kind of pressure are we talking about?" Victoria hesitated, weighing how much truth this man could handle without losing respect for her or deciding her problems were too complex for simple solutions. He'd saved her life and asked for nothing in return, but that didn't mean he was prepared for the full magnitude of what she faced. He holds the mortgage on my ranch, $60,000 my father borrowed for expansion before he died. The terms require a male cosigner for any woman inheriting property of substantial value. Cal whistled softly, the sound cutting through morning air, like acknowledgement of forces beyond normal human experience. $60,000 represented more money than most men would see in several lifetimes combined, a sum that could purchase entire counties in some parts of the territory. How much land are we talking about? 25,000 acres, 5,000 head of cattle, the largest single operation between here and Denver, with connections to markets in Chicago and Kansas City. She watched his face carefully, noting how the numbers affected him. My father built an empire, Mr. Mitchell. Now everyone wants to help me manage it for my own good. The way she said help made it clear what she thought of such assistance. Cal leaned back against the wall, processing information that painted their situation in an entirely different light than simple storm rescue. Victoria commanded resources that dwarfed anything in his experience in Montana territory. Sterling Ranch, he said suddenly, the name clicking into place like pieces of a complicated puzzle. You're Catherine Sterling's daughter. I am Catherine Sterling, she corrected, and there was steel beneath the silk in her voice. Victoria Catherine Sterling, current owner and operator of Sterling Ranch, much to the dismay of men who believe women lack the intellectual capacity for complex business decisions. Cal stared at her, understanding flooding through him like cold mountain water. Catherine Sterling was legendary throughout Montana territory, a name spoken with respect in every saloon and bunkhouse from Miles City to Helena. She controlled more land and cattle than some small countries, wielded political influence that reached into territorial governance, commanded respect from men who'd built their own empires from sweat and determination and sheer stubborn will. And he'd found her half frozen in a snowdrift, brought her to a line shack that barely qualified as shelter, and spent the night treating her like any woman who needed help surviving circumstances beyond her control. Jesus Christ, he breathed. Does it change anything? Victoria asked quietly, and her voice carried vulnerability that the Sterling name couldn't protect against. Now that you know who I am and what I represent? The question hung between them like a blade, sharp with potential to cut through whatever connection had grown during their night of shared survival. Cal felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settling on his shoulders like lead blankets, the voice that highlighted the distance between their circumstances, a gap measured in more than money through honest work. But looking at her face in the morning light, seeing vulnerability behind wealth and loneliness behind power, he realized something important. The woman who'd shared stories by the fire wasn't Catherine Sterling, cattle baroness and territorial power broker. She was Victoria, someone who'd been running from people who wanted to own her choices, someone who'd trusted him with truths that mattered more than money or land or social position. Changes what I know about the size of your problems, he said finally, meeting her eyes steadily. Doesn't change what I know about you as a person. Relief flickered across her features so quickly he almost missed it, like sun breaking through clouds for just a moment before disappearing again. Most men find my situation intimidating once they understand what's involved. Most men measure their worth by what they can control instead of what they can contribute. Cal stood, adding wood to the fire with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what he'd learned. Besides, seems like you need a friend more than you need someone impressed by your cattle count or bank balance. The simple acceptance in those words nearly undid her carefully maintained composure. When was the last time someone had offered friendship without calculating what they might gain from association with the Sterling name? When had anyone seen past the empire to the woman who carried its weight? But before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the morning air like warning bells. Cal moved to the window immediately, peering through frost-covered glass at shapes emerging from the white landscape beyond. 3 riders approaching at steady pace through snow that reached their horses' bellies. Dark figures against endless white, moving with purpose that suggested they knew exactly where they were headed. Your people? Cal asked. Victoria joined him at the window, and her expression shifted from relief to something more complicated as she recognized the lead rider. Miguel Cervantes, my foreman. He's been with the ranch since before my father died. The other 2 are ranch hands Tom Bradley and Jake Winters, Good men both. But there was tension in her voice that suggested complications beyond simple rescue. Cal watched her face as the riders drew closer, noting how he seemed to be preparing herself for something unpleasant. The men pulled up outside the cabin in a spray of snow, their horses breathing hard from the difficult ride through deep drifts. Miguel Cervantes swung down from his saddle, a man in his mid-40s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working under the Montana sun. His clothing marked him as a ranch management good quality, but practical, expensive enough to show his status, but designed for real work. "Miss Sterling," Miguel called, relief evident in his voice as he approached the cabin door. "Thank God you're safe. The whole ranch has been searching since the storm hit." Cal opened the door, stepping aside to let the foreman enter, while noting how Miguel's eyes took in every detail of the situation. The man was clearly protective of Victoria, assessing potential threats with the instincts of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. "Miguel," Victoria said, and Cal heard her voice change subtly, taking on the tone of someone accustomed to command. "I'm grateful you found me. This is Cal Mitchell, the man who saved my life. Without his help, I would have frozen to death in the storm." Miguel nodded to Cal with professional courtesy, but his assessment was thorough and skeptical. "Mr. Mitchell, the ranch owes you a debt for protecting Miss Sterling. We were afraid we'd lost her when her horse came back without a rider." "Anyone would have done the same," Cal replied, but he felt the weight of scrutiny from all three men. Class differences were immediately apparent in everything from clothing to horses to the subtle dynamics of who spoke first and how they positioned themselves in the small space. Tom Bradley and Jake Winters remained near their horses, respectful but clearly curious about what had transpired during the night. Their presence reminded Cal forcefully of the gulf between his world and Victoria's, between a line rider who owned nothing but his horse and saddle and the woman who employed dozens of men like these. "We need to get you back to the ranch," Miguel continued, his tone suggesting urgency beyond simple concern for Victoria's comfort. "There have been developments in your absence that require immediate attention." Victoria's expression sharpened. "What kind of developments?" "Theodore Blackstone arrived this morning, just after the storm cleared. He'd been waiting in Helena for travel conditions to improve. He's been quite concerned about your disappearance, demanding that we organize search parties and threatening to involve territorial authorities if you weren't found quickly." The name hit the cabin's atmosphere like a physical blow. Cal saw Victoria's face go pale, not from cold, but from understanding of what Blackstone's presence at the ranch meant for her situation. "He's at Sterling Ranch? Now?" "Yes, ma'am. Took over the guest room and has been holding meetings with some of the hands, asking questions about ranch operations and your management decisions." Miguel's disapproval was evident in his voice. "Also been asking specific questions about your whereabouts yesterday. He had men watching the main roads, which is why you had to take the mountain trail alone." Victoria and Cal exchanged glances loaded with meaning. If Blackstone was already investigating her movements, her night spent alone with Cal could be twisted into ammunition for his legal campaign to have her declared incompetent. "We need to leave immediately," Victoria said, moving toward her dried clothes with sudden urgency. "How long will it take to reach the ranch?" 3 hours through this snow if we push hard." Miguel stepped outside to give her privacy while she changed, but his voice carried clearly through the door. "Mr. Mitchell, you're welcome to ride with us if you need transportation back in the Thompson place." Cal felt the offer like a door closing on possibilities he'd barely begun to imagine. The return to Sterling Ranch would mean resuming their proper places in the social order, Victoria as the wealthy cattle baroness, and himself as a hired hand who'd simply done his job. But as Victoria emerged from the cabin, dressed in her riding habit, he saw something in her eyes that suggested the night's connection hadn't been imagined or forgotten. She moved to her horse with the confident grace of someone born to wealth and position, but her glance back at him carried messages that had nothing to do with social convention. "Mr. Mitchell," she said formally as Miguel helped her mount, "I hope our paths cross again. I remain in your debt." The words were proper and distant, exactly what the situation required in front of witnesses who might report every detail to interested parties. But her eyes told a different story, one that spoke of connections that couldn't be severed by returning to the world that had created the distances between them. The ride back to Sterling Ranch passed in relative silence. 4 horses struggling through snow that made conversation difficult and dangerous. Cal found himself positioned at the rear of the group, following behind like the hired help he technically was, watching Victoria straight back as she rode with the confident posture of someone accustomed to command. But he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself ready for whatever confrontation awaited at the ranch. Theodore Blackstone's presence there represented more than inconvenience. It was a direct challenge to her independence and possibly her freedom. The Sterling Ranch revealed itself gradually through the snowy landscape, and Cal felt his breath catch at the sheer magnitude of what Victoria controlled. The main house was a 2-story structure that could have housed 20 families, built from stone and timber that represented more money than he'd ever seen in one place. Barns stretched in multiple directions, corrals held dozens of horses, and the scale of the operation dwarfed anything he'd experienced in his years of ranch work. This was Victoria's world, and it might as well have been located on another planet for all the connection it had to his own circumstances. Yet as they approached the main house, he saw her straighten in her saddle with the bearing of someone preparing for battle, and he realized that all the wealth and land in Montana Territory couldn't protect her from the kind of threats that Theodore Blackstone represented. A figure emerged from the main house as they rode into the yard, and Cal knew immediately that this was the enemy Victoria had been fleeing. Theodore Blackstone was a man in his early 40s, well-dressed in the fashion of eastern cities, carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his authority respected without question. "Victoria, thank heavens," Blackstone called, approaching her horse with expressions of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been beside myself with worry. When your horse returned without you, I feared the worst." "As you can see, Theodore, I'm perfectly fine," Victoria replied, dismounting with Miguel's assistance while maintaining the cool politeness that wealthy people used as armor against unwanted attention. "I was fortunate enough to find shelter during the storm." Blackstone's gaze moved to Cal with the assessment of someone cataloging potential problems. "And you are?" "Cal Mitchell," Victoria answered before Cal could speak. "The man who saved my life. Without his quick thinking and assistance, the storm would have killed me." "How fortunate," Blackstone said, but his tone suggested he found the situation anything but fortunate. "I trust nothing inappropriate occurred during your shelter together." The implication hung in the air like poison gas, and Cal felt his jaw clench with anger at the insult to Victoria's reputation. But before he could respond, Victoria stepped forward with the kind of presence that reminded everyone present exactly who owned the ground they stood on. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, and ice crystals could have formed from her voice, "I find your implication insulting to both myself and Mr. Mitchell, who behaved with complete propriety while saving my life. Perhaps you should concern yourself with your own behavior rather than imagining impropriety where none existed." The rebuke was delivered with surgical precision, cutting Blackstone down to size while simultaneously establishing Victoria's authority over the situation. But Cal could see calculation in the banker's eyes, noting details that could be twisted into weapons for future use. "Of course, my dear," Blackstone said smoothly. "I meant no offense. It's simply that a woman's reputation is such a delicate thing, easily damaged by circumstances beyond her control." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Blackstone was serving notice that he had ammunition to use against Victoria if she continued to resist his plans for her future. The night in the cabin, innocent as it had been, could be portrayed as scandalous behavior that demonstrated her unfitness for managing significant business interests. "I'm sure Mr. Mitchell has pressing business elsewhere," Blackstone continued, dismissing Cal with the kind of casual authority that wealthy men used to move inconvenient people out of their way. "We shouldn't keep him from his duties any longer than necessary." Cal felt the dismissal like a slap, but he also understood the game being played. His continued presence would only provide Blackstone with more ammunition to use against Victoria. The best thing he could do for her was disappear, removing himself as a source of scandal or embarrassment. "Miss Sterling," he said formally, touching his hat brim in the gesture of respect that hired men showed to their betters. "I'm glad you made it back safely. I'll be heading back to the Thompson place now." But as he turned toward his horse, Victoria's voice stopped him. "Mr. Mitchell, a moment, please." She approached him with the measured steps of someone who understood they were being watched by hostile eyes. When she spoke, her voice was low enough that only he could hear, but her words carried the weight of promises and possibilities. "This isn't finished," she said quietly. "Whatever he thinks he can do to control me, whatever games he wants to play, I won't be forced into submission by threats and legal maneuvering." "Be careful," Cal replied, matching her low tone. "Men like that don't give up easily when they want something as badly as he wants your ranch." "Let him try," Victoria said, and steel rang in her voice despite its whisper volume. "I've been fighting for what's mine since the day my father died. I'm not about to stop now because some banker thinks a woman can't manage her own affairs." She pressed something into his hand, a small piece of paper folded tight. "3 days from now. The location is on the paper. If you're willing to help me fight this, be there." Before he could respond, she stepped back and spoke in her normal voice, loud enough for the watching men to hear. "Thank you again for your assistance, Mr. Mitchell. The ranch is grateful for your service." Cal pocketed the paper without looking at it, mounted his horse, and rode away from Sterling Ranch with the feeling that his life had just taken another sharp turn toward complications he couldn't yet understand. But as he reached the edge of the property and looked back, he saw Victoria standing on the porch of the main house. Her figure small against the massive structure, but somehow dominating the scene through sheer force of will. Theodore Blackstone might think he held all the advantages in whatever game he was playing, but he clearly didn't understand the woman he was trying to control. Victoria Sterling had survived a Montana blizzard through determination and courage, and she wasn't likely to surrender her independence to anyone without a fight that would be remembered long after the snow melted and spring returned to the territory. The paper in Cal's pocket felt like a promise and a challenge combined. Whatever Victoria had planned for 3 days hence, it would require the kind of courage that had driven her into a blizzard rather than accept a future chosen by someone else. As he rode toward the Thompson Ranch through snow that was already beginning to show signs of melting, Cal realized that his wandering days might finally be coming to an end. Not because he'd found another group or another place to spend his restless energy, but because he'd found something worth fighting for. Something worth the risk of putting down roots that might get torn up again by forces beyond his control. Something that mattered more than the safety of staying uninvolved in other people's battles. The storm that had brought Victoria into his life was over, but the real weather was just beginning. And this time, he wouldn't be riding alone into whatever challenges lay ahead. 3 days later, Cal rode toward the coordinates Victoria had written on that small piece of paper, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The meeting place was an abandoned line shack 15 miles north of the Sterling Ranch, far enough from prying eyes to allow honest conversation, but close enough to reach quickly if circumstances demanded speed over caution. The weather had turned clear and cold, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made distant mountains look close enough to touch, and shadows sharp as knife edges on snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds. His horse's breath formed white clouds in air so clean it seemed to burn his lungs with each inhalation, and the only sounds were hoofbeats muffled by snow and the occasional crack of settling timber in the vast wilderness that stretched beyond every horizon. He'd spent the past 3 days working for Jonas Wheeler at the Double J Ranch, trying to focus on ordinary tasks like mending fence and checking water holes while his mind replayed every conversation he'd shared with Victoria in that storm-bound cabin. The memory of her voice, her laugh, the way firelight had played across her features, haunted him like music heard in dreams that faded upon waking, but left an ache for something beautiful just beyond recall. Wheeler had noticed his distraction with the sharp eyes of a man who'd managed ranch hands for 30 years. "Whatever's eating at you, Mitchell, either settle it or move on. Can't have men working for me who ain't got their minds on the job." The criticism stung because it was accurate. Cal's thoughts had been 15 miles south at Sterling Ranch, wondering what battles Victoria was fighting against Theodore Blackstone's attempts to control her future. The 3 days had felt like 3 months, each hour crawling past like wounded animals seeking shelter from storms that showed no signs of breaking. Now, as the abandoned shack materialized from the winter landscape like a mirage made solid, Cal felt his pulse quicken with anticipation and fear in equal measure. Whatever Victoria had planned for this meeting, it would determine whether the connection forged in desperate circumstances could survive the harsh light of ordinary reality. The shack stood empty and cold, its single window reflecting morning sunlight like a blind eye staring across endless white expanses. Cal dismounted, checked his pocket watch, and realized he was 20 minutes early. Nervous energy had driven him from the Double J before dawn, unable to wait any longer for whatever revelation or disappointment this day would bring. He built a small fire in the shack's stone hearth, more for something to do with his hands than for warmth. The familiar ritual of splitting kindling and coaxing flame from tinder helped calm nerves that felt stretched tight as fence wire in winter wind. As the fire caught and began to push back the cabin's chill, he heard hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Victoria rode alone, mounted on a beautiful chestnut mare that probably cost more than most men earned in 5 years. She wore a heavy coat of deep blue wool over practical riding clothes, and her face carried the determined expression of someone who'd made difficult decisions and intended to see them through regardless of consequences. "You came," she said, dismounting with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. "Said I would." Men say many things when circumstances make promises easy to give. She tied her horse to the shack's hitching post with movements that spoke of suppressed, nervous energy. Following through when the stakes become real is considerably more challenging. Cal pushed open the cabin door, noting how she paused for just a moment before entering the small space where everything between them had begun. The fire cast moving shadows across walls that seemed to hold memories of another storm, another night when two strangers had discovered unexpected connections and circumstances that should have killed at least one of them. "How bad has it been?" he asked, settling near the fire while Victoria warmed her hands at the flames. "Worse than I expected, and I've learned to expect the worst from men like Theodore Blackstone." Her voice carried exhaustion that spoke of battles fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. "He's been questioning my ranch hands about my management decisions, examining financial records, and spreading carefully worded doubts about my mental stability throughout the territory." "Any luck fighting back?" "Some. My attorney in Helena believes we can contest the competency hearing, but Blackstone has been thorough in building his case." She turned from the fire to face him directly. "3 doctors willing to testify that my rejection of his marriage proposal indicates emotional instability. Bank officials prepared to question my business judgment. Territorial officials who believe women lack the intellectual capacity for managing large enterprises." The systematic nature of Blackstone's campaign was impressive in its thoroughness and terrifying in its implications. He'd clearly been planning this assault on Victoria's independence for months, waiting for the right moment to spring legal traps that would transfer control of the Sterling Empire to himself. What kind of evidence does he have? Nothing substantial, but in territorial court, innuendo can be as damaging as proof if presented skillfully. Victoria's hands clenched into fists as she spoke. "He's documented every business decision I've made since inheriting the ranch, twisting sound management into evidence of feminine hysteria. Hiring decisions, cattle purchases, land improvements, all reinterpreted through the lens of supposed incompetence. In the night in the cabin, he knows about it. Miguel mentioned finding us together to the wrong person, and word reached Blackstone within hours." Victoria's voice turned bitter. A single woman spending the night alone with a hired hand, regardless of circumstances, becomes evidence of poor judgment and moral deficiency in his version of events. Cal felt anger building in his chest like heat from the fire. Bastards twisting a rescue into something dirty. It's worse than that. He's positioning himself as my protector, the concerned family friend trying to save me from my own poor decisions. Victoria began pacing the small cabin like a caged animal seeking escape. "According to his narrative, I need male guidance to prevent further incidents that could damage my reputation and, by extension, threaten the ranch's stability." The elegant trap was becoming clearer. Blackstone had engineered a situation where Victoria's independence itself became evidence of her unfitness to maintain that independence. Every act of self-determination could be twisted into proof that she needed the very guardianship she was fighting to avoid. "What's your plan?" Victoria stopped pacing and looked at him with an expression that mixed determination with something that might have been desperation. "I'm going to fight him on every front available, but I need allies who aren't afraid of Blackstone's influence or worried about their own reputations." "Meaning?" "Meaning I need someone who understands ranch operations, can testify to my competence, and isn't connected to the territorial political machine that Blackstone has been cultivating for years. She moved closer to the fire, and Cal caught the scent of lavender soap that reminded him forcefully of their night together. Someone like you. The request hit him like cold water. Victoria, I'm nobody. A drifter who lost his own land. My testimony would be worthless against doctors and bank officials. Your testimony would be honest, which might be worth more than all their purchased expertise combined. Victoria knelt beside him near the fire, close enough that he could see gold flecks in her blue eyes. You've seen me make decisions under extreme pressure. You know I'm capable of clear thinking and decisive action when lives depend on it. That's not the same as running a business operation worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, isn't it? The night we were trapped, I assessed our situation, made rational decisions about conserving resources, and worked with you as a partner rather than expecting to be cared for like a helpless child. Victoria's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Those are exactly the qualities needed for successful ranch management, and you witnessed them firsthand. Cal stared into the fire, understanding the logic of her argument while simultaneously recognizing the impossibility of the position she was asking him to take. Testifying would mean standing up in territorial court and claiming that Catherine Sterling is competent to manage her own affairs. Do you understand what that would look like? A hired hand defending a cattle baroness against established businessmen and medical professionals? It would look like courage. The simple statement hung between them like a challenge, and Cal felt something shift in his chest. Throughout his life, he'd prided himself on doing what was right, regardless of consequences. But he'd been choosing his battles carefully since losing the farm. Safe fights with clear outcomes, situations where honor didn't require risking everything he had left. But looking at Victoria's face in the firelight, seeing hope and fear warring in her expression, he realized that some battles were worth fighting regardless of odds or outcomes. Some stands needed to be taken not because victory was assured, but because surrender meant accepting a world where justice bent to money and strength bowed to influence. There's something else, Victoria continued, reaching into her coat pocket. Something I haven't told you about my father's will. She withdrew a folded document, expensive paper with the weight and feel of legal importance. My father was a careful man who understood exactly what kind of pressure would be brought to bear on any woman inheriting substantial property. He included specific provisions designed to protect me from men like Theodore Blackstone. What kind of provisions? A partnership clause. If I can demonstrate that I have a capable business partner, willing to share responsibility for ranch operations, the inheritance becomes joint property held by both parties. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the document. The male co-signer requirement disappears if I choose a partner through my own free will rather than accepting guardianship imposed by the court. Cal felt his world tilt on its axis. You're talking about marriage. I'm talking about partnership, a legal arrangement that protects the ranch from Blackstone's schemes while preserving my independence. Victoria met his eyes steadily. Marriage could be part of it, but only if both parties chose that path freely. The offer was stunning in its implications. Victoria was proposing to share ownership of one of Montana Territory's largest ranches with a drifter who owned nothing but his horse and saddle. The Sterling Empire, worth more than most men could imagine, offered as partnership rather than charity, or payment for services rendered. Why me? Cal asked quietly. Because you're the only man who's seen me at my worst and still treated me as an equal. Because you've never looked at me and calculated what you might gain from association with my name or wealth. Victoria's voice softened. Because in that cabin during the storm, I felt like myself for the first time since my father died. Not Catherine Sterling, burden carrier and target for every ambitious man in the territory, but just Victoria. The honesty in her words cut through every defense he'd built against hope. Since losing the farm, Cal had convinced himself that wanting things beyond survival was dangerous, that dreams were luxuries he couldn't afford when each day required full attention just to keep moving forward. But Victoria was offering more than wealth or security. She was offering the chance to build something together, to create a partnership based on mutual respect and shared vision rather than social convention or economic convenience. What happens if I say yes and we lose in court anyway? Then we face the consequences together instead of alone. Victoria reached out, covering his hand with hers. I'd rather fight beside someone I trust and lose than win by accepting a future chosen by someone else. Her touch burned through him like lightning, connecting circuits that had been dark since the night he'd ridden away from everything he'd ever called home. The warmth of her fingers, the steady pressure of her palm against his, felt like belonging in a way that had nothing to do with property ownership or social position. If we do this, there's no going back, Cal said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Blackstone won't give up easily, and there'll be folks who think you've lost your mind partnering with a man like me. Let them think what they want. I stopped caring about other people's opinions the night I rode into a blizzard rather than accept a future I hadn't chosen. Victoria's grip on his hand tightened. The question is whether you're brave enough to take the risk with me. Cal looked into her eyes, seeing strength that had been forged in fires he could only imagine. This was Catherine Sterling, who'd built her father's legacy into something larger than his dreams, offering to share that achievement with a man who'd never imagined such possibilities existed. But more than that, this was Victoria, the woman who'd trusted him with her fears and vulnerabilities during the worst night of her life, the person who'd seen past his failures to recognize qualities he'd forgotten he possessed. I'm in, he said quietly. Relief flooded across Victoria's features like sunrise after the longest night. Then we need to move quickly. The hearing is tomorrow morning, and Blackstone will have spent the past 3 days preparing his case. What do we need to do? First, we need to file the partnership documents with the territorial clerk's office before court convenes. The timing is crucial if we want the judge to consider my father's provisions as part of the competency determination. Victoria was already moving toward the door, her decisive energy returning now that plans were being made. Then we need to gather witnesses who can testify to both our competence and the legitimacy of our partnership. Who's going to believe we formed a genuine business partnership in 3 days? Victoria paused at the threshold, looking back at him with an expression that mixed mischief with determination. Anyone who's paying attention to how we work together. The partnership may be new, but the foundation for it was laid that night in the storm when we proved we could face impossible odds as equals. The ride to Helena took 6 hours through snow that was finally beginning to show signs of serious melting. Victoria had arranged to meet them there with Maria Esperanza, who would serve as witness to the partnership documents, and Miguel Cervantes, whose testimony about Victoria's ranch management would carry weight with territorial officials who respected his reputation. As they rode, Victoria explained the legal complexities they would face. Territorial law heavily favored male authority in business matters, but her father's will had been crafted by lawyers who understood how to work within existing statutes while protecting women's rights through careful language and specific provisions. The key is demonstrating that our partnership serves the ranch's interests rather than representing a desperate attempt to avoid legitimate oversight, Victoria explained as they paused to rest their horses near a creek that ran clear and cold between snow-covered banks. Blackstone will argue that I'm using the partnership clause to circumvent proper legal procedures. In our response, that I'm exercising the rights my father specifically granted me while choosing a partner based on demonstrated competence rather than accepting guardianship imposed by men with financial interests in controlling the ranch. Victoria's breath formed white clouds in the cold air as she spoke. The will gives me explicit authority to select my own business associate, and you've proven your ability to make sound decisions under pressure. The logic was sound, but Cal understood that logic didn't always prevail in courtrooms, where influence and prejudice could carry more weight than evidence and reason. They would be fighting an uphill battle against assumptions that favored Blackstone's position, regardless of legal technicalities. But as they resumed their ride toward Helena, Cal felt something he hadn't experienced since losing the farm, the satisfaction of fighting for something that mattered. Win or lose, he would stand beside Victoria in that courtroom and testify to her strength, intelligence, and capability. After years of drifting without purpose, he finally had a reason to plant his feet and refuse to be moved. Helena appeared through the trees like a promise and a threat combined, the territorial capital bustling with the kind of activity that marked it as the center of political and legal power in Montana. The courthouse dominated the town's center, a stone building that represented justice and law for citizens scattered across hundreds of thousands of square miles of frontier territory. Victoria had reserved rooms at the Helena Hotel, the territory's finest accommodation, and the kind of place where influential people gathered to conduct business away from public scrutiny. As they approached the imposing brick structure, Cal felt the weight of his simple clothes and working man's appearance like armor that would either protect him or mark him as an outsider trying to enter a world where he didn't belong. "Second thoughts?" Victoria asked quietly as they prepared to dismount. "About a dozen of them," Cal admitted. "But I'm still here. That's all the courage I need to see." Maria Esperanza met them in the hotel lobby, her stern face softening with relief when she saw Victoria arrive safely. The older woman had worked for the Sterling family for 20 years, and her loyalty to Victoria was evident in every protective glance and worried gesture. "Señorita Victoria, I have prepared everything as you requested," Maria said. "I brought the partnership template documents your father's lawyer prepared years ago. He anticipated this situation. Samuel Morrison reviewed them overnight and made the necessary modifications, and Miguel is waiting upstairs with the witness statements." "Any word from Blackstone?" "He arrived this morning with 2 lawyers from Denver and has been meeting with court officials since before noon." Maria's expression darkened. "That man moves through this hotel like he owns it, demanding service and making threats about what will happen to anyone who fails to cooperate with his legal proceedings." The intimidation was clearly calculated, designed to make potential witnesses think twice about opposing someone with Blackstone's apparent influence and resources. But Maria's contempt for such tactics was obvious, and Cal realized that Victoria had allies who couldn't be bought or frightened into submission. Miguel Cervantes awaited them in Victoria's suite, along with 2 other men Cal didn't recognize. The foreman rose as they entered, his weathered face showing relief at seeing his employer safe, but concern about the challenges they faced. "Miss Sterling, Mr. Mitchell." Miguel nodded to each of them formally. "I prepared statements documenting your ranch management decisions over the past 6 months, including specific examples of improved efficiency and increased profitability under your leadership." "And our friends here?" Miguel gestured toward the 2 strangers. "Samuel Morrison, attorney from Miles City who specializes in territorial property law. He'll be representing you in court tomorrow. And Jonas Wheeler from the Double J Ranch, who can testify to Mr. Mitchell's character and competence." Cal felt surprise and gratitude in equal measure as Wheeler stepped forward to shake his hand. "Didn't expect to see you here, Jonas." "Heard through the grapevine that you were taking a stand for something important," Wheeler replied with a slight smile. "Figure any man brave enough to partner with Catherine Sterling against Theodore Blackstone deserves support from folks who respect honest work over political maneuvering." The revelation that word of their partnership had already spread throughout the ranching community was both encouraging and concerning. Encouraging because it suggested they had more support than expected. Concerning because it meant Blackstone would have advance warning about their strategy. Samuel Morrison proved to be a sharp-faced man in his 40s who radiated the kind of confidence that came from winning difficult cases against superior resources. "Miss Sterling, Mr. Mitchell, I've reviewed your father's will and the partnership documents Maria prepared. Legally, your position is sound, but we'll be fighting territorial prejudices that favor traditional authority structures." "What are our chances?" Victoria asked directly. "Better than they would be without the partnership clause. But success will depend on convincing Judge Harrison that your arrangement serves legitimate business purposes rather than representing an attempt to circumvent proper oversight." Morrison spread legal documents across the room's table. "Blackstone's lawyers will argue that a 3-day partnership between a wealthy woman and a hired hand demonstrates exactly the kind of poor judgment that justifies guardianship. How do we counter that argument? By demonstrating that your partnership is based on sound business reasoning and Mr. Mitchell's proven competence rather than desperation or romantic attachment." Morrison looked directly at Cal. "Your testimony will be crucial. You need to present yourself as a capable rancher who recognizes a good business opportunity when it appears, not as someone swept up in circumstances beyond his understanding." Cal nodded, understanding the delicate balance required. Too much deference to Victoria's superior wealth and position would make him seem like a fortune hunter. Too much confidence might appear presumptuous for a man of his circumstances. The key was projecting competence and partnership rather than submission or gold digging. What about character witnesses? Victoria asked. Wheeler's testimony will be valuable, and Miguel's statements about ranch operations under your management provide concrete evidence of competence. Morrison gathered the documents into organized piles, but ultimately this case will be decided on Judge Harrison's assessment of whether your partnership represents genuine business collaboration or desperate maneuvering to avoid legitimate oversight. The evening passed in preparation and strategy sessions, with Morrison coaching both Victoria and Cal on courtroom procedures and potential questions from opposing lawyers. The complexity of territorial law surprised Cal, who'd never realized how many statutes and precedents could be applied to determine a person's right to control their own property. As the night wore on and other participants gradually retired to their rooms, Cal found himself alone with Victoria on the hotel balcony overlooking Helena's main street. Gas lamps created pools of yellow light in the darkness below, and the sounds of evening activity drifted up from saloons and restaurants where territorial politicians and businessmen conducted the informal negotiations that often mattered more than official proceedings. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Victoria asked, pulling her shawl tighter against the cold mountain air. As ready as a man can be for something he never imagined doing. Cal leaned against the balcony railing, watching carriages pass in the street below. "Still feels like a dream that might disappear when morning comes." "Dreams don't disappear unless we let them." Victoria moved closer, her shoulder brushing his as they stood together in the darkness. "My father used to say that the only dreams worth having are the ones that scare you a little when you think about achieving them. This partnership scares me more than a little." "Good. That means it matters enough to fight for." Victoria turned to face him, and in the dim light from the hotel windows, Cal could see determination mixed with vulnerability in her expression. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that asking you to stand with me was the easiest decision I've made since inheriting the ranch. Even if we lose? Even if we lose. Some things are worth doing regardless of outcome, and choosing your own allies is one of them." Victoria reached out, taking his hand in hers with a gesture that had become familiar during their brief time together. "Besides, I don't plan on losing." And the confidence in her voice reminded Cal why Catherine Sterling commanded respect throughout Montana Territory. This was a woman who'd built her father's dreams into something larger than he'd imagined, who turned inheritance into empire through intelligence and determination that couldn't be purchased or inherited. Tomorrow would bring the courtroom battle that would determine whether their partnership survived its first serious test. But standing together in the darkness overlooking the territorial capital, Cal felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. The certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, fighting for something that mattered alongside someone who understood what it meant to build rather than simply survive. Whatever Judge Harrison decided, whatever arguments Blackstone's lawyers presented, whatever prejudices they faced in that courtroom, they would meet those challenges as partners. Equal stakes, shared risks, and the kind of trust that grew from surviving storms together. The next morning would bring its own weather, but tonight Cal and Victoria planned their future by lamplight. Two people who'd found in each other the missing pieces they hadn't known they were searching for. The territorial courthouse awaited, imposing and final as mountain granite. But inside this hotel room, surrounded by legal documents and alliance plans, something precious and indestructible was taking shape. Their love story had begun in a blizzard. Tomorrow, it would continue in a courtroom where the stakes were higher than survival, where they would fight not just for property or legal rights, but for the freedom to choose their own destiny together. Win or lose, they would face that challenge as they'd face the storm, together, as equals, with courage that drew strength from partnership rather than asking for protection they didn't need. Dawn broke gray and cold over Helena as Cal adjusted his only decent shirt for the third time, hands trembling slightly despite his efforts to appear calm. The territorial courthouse loomed across the street from the Helena Hotel, its stone facade as imposing as the mountain peaks that surrounded the capital city. Today would determine whether their partnership could survive its first test under the harsh scrutiny of territorial law. Victoria appeared at his side, dressed in her finest dark blue traveling suit, the same color as the coat she'd worn into that blizzard. Her hair was arranged in an elegant style that spoke of wealth and refinement, but Cal could see the steel in her eyes that no amount of fine clothing could soften. "Ready?" she asked quietly. "As I'll ever be." They walked across the street together, followed by Samuel Morrison, Miguel Cervantes, and Jonas Wheeler. Word had spread throughout the territory about the hearing, and Cal noted how many people had gathered outside the courthouse. Some faces showed support, others curiosity, and a few carried the calculating expressions of those who smelled opportunity in other people's legal troubles. The courtroom was packed to capacity, with standing room only along the walls. Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man in his 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades weighing evidence in human nature, took his seat at the bench with the gravity the moment demanded. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The territory of Montana versus the competency of Victoria Catherine Sterling to manage her inherited properties." Theodore Blackstone sat at the plaintiff's table with his two Denver lawyers, men who radiated the kind of confidence that came from winning cases in courts where influence mattered more than justice. They'd arranged their documents with military precision, each paper placed exactly where it would be most effective during their presentation. Morrison stood to present their opening argument, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed courtroom. "Your Honor, we are here today because a woman dared to inherit property that men believed they could manage better. The plaintiff seeks to have Miss Sterling declared incompetent based not on evidence of actual incompetence, but on prejudice against women who refuse to accept male authority they never requested or required." He gestured toward Victoria, who sat straight-backed and composed despite the weight of hostile stares. "Miss Sterling has increased ranch profitability by 20% in the 6 months since inheriting it. She has improved working conditions for her employees, expanded market connections, and demonstrated every quality we would praise in a male rancher. Her only crime, if we can call it that, is being born female in a territory that struggles to accept women as equals." Blackstone's lead attorney rose to respond, a thin man named Prescott, who spoke with the polished delivery of someone accustomed to swaying judges through eloquence rather than evidence. "Your Honor, we are not here to debate women's capabilities in general, but to address the specific case of a young woman who has demonstrated questionable judgment in both business and personal matters." He produced a thick folder of documents. "The evidence will show that Miss Sterling has made impulsive decisions, rejected sound advice from experienced businessmen, and most recently entered into a suspicious partnership with a drifter she met under circumstances that raised serious questions about her decision-making process." The words hit Cal like physical blows, each syllable designed to paint him as an opportunist who'd taken advantage of Victoria's supposed weakness. But he forced himself to remain calm, remembering Morrison's coaching about maintaining dignity under attack. "We will demonstrate that this so-called partnership is nothing more than a desperate attempt to circumvent proper legal oversight," Prescott continued. "A arrangement so hastily conceived that it defies credibility as legitimate business collaboration." The prosecution's case unfolded with methodical precision. They called Dr. Whitman, a physician from Denver who'd never met Victoria but was willing to testify that her rejection of Blackstone's marriage proposal indicated emotional instability. The testimony was pure theater, medical opinions purchased and delivered with practiced authority. "In my professional opinion," De Whitman declared, "a woman who refuses a suitable marriage offer in favor of business partnership with an unsuitable man displays the kind of erratic thinking that suggests underlying mental deficiency." Morrison objected repeatedly, but Judge Harrison allowed the testimony to continue, his expression unreadable as he weighed competing claims about Victoria's mental state. Blackstone himself took the stand next, presenting himself as the concerned family friend trying to protect Victoria from her own poor judgment. "I've known Victoria since she was a child," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of paternal concern. "Her father was my dear friend, and I promised him I would look after her welfare. When she began making increasingly erratic decisions after inheriting the ranch, I felt obligated to seek legal protection for both her and her father's legacy." The performance was masterful, painting Blackstone as a reluctant guardian forced to intervene by circumstances beyond his control. He detailed every business decision Victoria had made, reframing sound management as evidence of feminine hysteria and logical planning as proof of incompetence. When Morrison cross-examined him, the banker's mask slipped slightly. "Mr. Blackstone, what exactly is your financial interest in the Sterling Ranch?" "I hold the mortgage, which gives me a legitimate concern for the property's management." "A $60,000 mortgage that could be foreclosed if Miss Sterling were declared incompetent?" "The ranch's stability is important to all stakeholders, including yourself, who would presumably benefit from controlling such a valuable property." Blackstone's eyes flashed with anger before he recovered his composure. "I seek only to protect Victoria from decisions she may later regret." Then it was their turn to present Victoria's defense. Miguel took the stand first, his weathered face serious as he detailed the ranch's improved performance under Victoria's management. "Miss Sterling knows more about cattle and land management than most men I've worked with. She's increased our profits while treating the hands fairly, something not every ranch owner manages." Jonas Wheeler followed, testifying to Cal's character and competence. "I've employed dozens of men over the years, and Cal Mitchell ranks among the most reliable and knowledgeable ranch hands I've known. Any outfit would be lucky to have him as a partner." Finally, it was Cal's turn to testify. He stood and walked to the witness stand on legs that felt steadier than he'd expected, drawing strength from Victoria's encouraging nod. The courtroom fell silent as he placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Morrison began with simple questions about Cal's background and experience, establishing his credentials as someone qualified to judge ranch management. Then they moved to the crucial testimony about the storm and its aftermath. "Mr. Mitchell, during the time you were trapped with Miss Sterling, how would you characterize her decision-making under extreme pressure?" Cal looked directly at Victoria, drawing confidence from her steady gaze. "Miss Sterling assessed our situation accurately, made rational decisions about resource conservation, and worked as an equal partner rather than expecting special treatment. She demonstrated exactly the kind of clear thinking and decisive action that successful ranch management requires." "Did you observe any signs of the emotional instability or poor judgment that has been alleged?" "None whatsoever. Miss Sterling showed courage, intelligence, and practical skills that impressed me throughout our ordeal." Prescott's cross-examination was brutal, designed to portray Cal as an opportunist who'd manipulated a vulnerable woman. "Mr. Mitchell, isn't it true that you saw an opportunity to advance yourself financially through association with a wealthy woman?" "No, sir. I had no knowledge of Miss Sterling's identity or wealth when I found her in the storm. I helped her because it was the right thing to do." "Yet within days of learning her true identity, you entered into a business partnership that would make you wealthy beyond your wildest dreams." Cal felt the trap closing but stuck to the truth. "Miss Sterling offered the partnership based on demonstrated competence and mutual respect. The financial benefits weren't the primary consideration for either of us." "Come now, Mr. Mitchell, are we to believe that a drifter with no property or prospects wouldn't be motivated by the chance to own part of a ranch worth hundreds of thousands of dollars?" The question hung in the courtroom like a knife blade, designed to expose him as either a liar or a fortune hunter. Cal took a deep breath, knowing his next words would determine everything. "Your Honor, I lost my family's farm 4 years ago to drought and debt. Since then, I've worked for wages and slept in bunkhouses, owning nothing but my horse and saddle. Yes, the financial opportunity Miss Sterling offered is beyond anything I could have achieved alone. But I didn't accept her partnership for money. I accepted it because I found in her the kind of person worth building something with, regardless of what either of us owned or lacked." Judge Harrison called for a brief recess to consider the testimony, leaving both sides to wait in tense silence while the packed courtroom buzzed with speculation. Victoria and Cal sat side by side, not speaking but drawing strength from each other's presence as the minutes crawled past like hours. When court reconvened, Judge Harrison's expression remained unreadable as he shuffled through his notes. The silence stretched until it felt brittle as winter ice, ready to shatter at the first word. "This case presents fundamental questions about women's rights under territorial law," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "The plaintiff seeks to have Miss Sterling declared incompetent based on business decisions that, in a man, would be considered sound management. and personal choices that, in a man, would be respected as individual liberty. Blackstone shifted uncomfortably in his seat, perhaps sensing that his carefully constructed case was beginning to crumble. The evidence presented shows that Sterling Ranch has prospered under Miss Sterling's management. Profits have increased, employee conditions have improved, and business relationships have been strengthened. These are not the achievements of an incompetent person, regardless of gender. Victoria's hand found Cal's under the table, her fingers intertwining with his as hope began to build in both their hearts. Furthermore, the partnership arrangement Miss Sterling has entered into appears to be both legally sound and practically beneficial. Her father's will explicitly grants her the right to choose business associates, and Mr. Mitchell's testimony demonstrates competence and character that would be valuable in any ranching operation. Judge Harrison paused, his gaze moving from Victoria to Cal to Blackstone with judicial precision. The court finds no evidence of mental incompetence or poor judgment sufficient to warrant the appointment of a guardian. Miss Sterling has demonstrated her capability to manage her inherited property, and her choice of business partner appears to be both legal under her father's will and beneficial to the ranch's continued prosperity. The gavel came down with the finality of thunder. The petition to declare Miss Sterling incompetent is denied. The court recognizes the validity of the Sterling-Mitchell Ranch partnership as established under the provisions of Marcus Sterling's will. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Supporters cheered while Blackstone's face flushed red with fury and defeat. His lawyers gathered their papers with the grim efficiency of men who'd lost a case they'd expected to win easily. Victoria turned to Cal, tears of relief streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," Cal corrected, squeezing her hand. "You stood up for what was yours and proved you had the strength to keep it." Blackstone approached their table as the crowd began to disperse, his composure cracked but not entirely broken. "This isn't over, Victoria. There are other ways to ensure proper management of significant properties." Victoria stood to face him, her voice carrying the authority that came from legal vindication and personal triumph. "Theodore, this is very much over. I suggest you focus on your banking business and leave ranch management to people who understand it." Miguel Cervantes appeared at Victoria's elbow, his weathered face split by a rare smile. "Miss Sterling, the boys are waiting outside to escort you home." Words already spreading throughout the territory about the court's decision. As they emerged from the courthouse, Cal was surprised to see dozens of ranchers and townspeople gathered in the street. Some he recognized from various outfits he'd worked for over the years. Others were strangers drawn by curiosity about the unusual case. Jonas Wheeler pushed through the crowd to shake Cal's hand. "Proud of you, partner. Takes real steel to stand up in court like that." "Wasn't just standing up in court," Cal replied, glancing at Victoria as she accepted congratulations from supporters. "Was standing up for something worth fighting for." The ride back to Sterling Ranch felt like a victory procession, with well-wishers accompanying them for miles before turning back toward their own spreads. Victoria rode beside Cal, her posture straight with vindication, but her eyes soft with something that looked like contentment. "What happens now?" Cal asked as the ranch buildings appeared through the trees. "Now we build what we started in that cabin," Victoria replied, "a partnership based on respect and trust in the kind of love that grows stronger when tested by storms." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the parlor of the Sterling Ranch main house, with Judge Harrison himself performing the ceremony at Victoria's request. The guest list included ranch hands, neighboring ranchers, townspeople from Helena, and anyone else who'd supported their fight for independence. Victoria wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit but carrying the weight of family tradition and new beginnings. Cal stood beside her in his best suit, purchased new for the occasion but chosen for practicality rather than fashion. They spoke their vows with the same honesty that had marked every conversation since that first night in the storm. "Do you, Victoria Catherine Sterling, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "Do you, Caleb Mitchell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live. I do, Cal replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle but firm, a promise of partnership that went deeper than legal documents or business arrangements. As the crowd cheered and celebrated, Cal felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for years, the certainty that he was exactly where he belonged. The Sterling Mitchell Ranch prospered under their joint management, combining Victoria's business acumen with Cal's practical knowledge of land and cattle. Within 5 years, they'd expanded operations to include horse breeding and had established the territory's most profitable cattle shipping operation. But more than business success, they built a life together that honored both their strengths and accepted their limitations. Victoria never lost her edge in business negotiations, and Cal never pretended to understand the social complexities of territorial politics. What they shared was more valuable than either individual skill, the knowledge that they could face any challenge together. They raised 5 children in that house, 3 boys and 2 girls who grew up understanding that strength came in many forms and that love meant choosing to build something together rather than demanding submission from each other. The fire in the hearth has burned low while I've been telling this story, Tommy, and your grandmother would have scolded us both for staying up so late. But some stories can't be rushed, and this one needed proper telling. So that's how you met Grandma, Tommy says, his young voice thoughtful in the lamplight, in a blizzard that nearly killed her. That's how we met, I confirm, reaching for another piece of wood to feed the dying fire. But that's not how we fell in love. When did that happen? I consider the question, thinking of all the moments that built into something larger than their individual parts. In that cabin, when I realized she saw me as more than just hired help. In the courtroom, when she trusted me to help her fight for what mattered. On our wedding day, when we promised to build something together. And every day since, when we chose to keep building instead of tearing down. Tommy nods with the seriousness of youth trying to understand adult complexities. Grandpa, do you think I'll ever find someone like that? I think you'll find exactly who you're meant to find when you're ready to be the kind of person worth finding. I stand, joints creaking with age and long sitting. But remember this, boy, love isn't something that happens to you like weather. It's something you choose to build, day after day, choice by choice, storm after storm. He helps me bank the fire and blow out the lamp, then follows me upstairs to the room that's been his whenever he visits. At his doorway, he pauses. Grandpa, thanks for telling me the real story. Thanks for listening, Tommy. Stories only matter when they're shared with someone who understands why they're worth telling. I close his door and make my way to the bedroom I've shared with Victoria for 40 years. She's already asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful in the darkness. I slip into bed beside her, careful not to wake her, and listen to the December wind rattling the windows of the house we built together. Some storms change a man's life forever, but the best storms are the ones that bring you exactly what you need, even when you don't know you need it. Especially when you don't know you need it. The fire downstairs dies to embers, and sleep comes easy in the warmth we've built together. One choice at a time, one day at a time, one storm at a time. Outside, Montana winter holds the land in its grip, but inside, love keeps everything warm.